Listen, Trump. I studied every African liberation hero you tried to erase, and from the lessons of Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah, and Cabral rises a strategy you cannot defeat. You believed your schools would teach us to worship Europe forever. Your books would hide our revolutionary ancestors endlessly. Your lies would keep us ignorant while we stayed mentally colonized and weak. You were totally wrong. I learned from our heroes. I copied their methods. Now, I will show you your flopped history. Your historical lies are exposed. Let me show you exactly how I discovered that our ancestors already solved every problem we face today, and Western education deliberately hid their solutions from us. I was sitting in school as a young student when my teacher taught us about democracy and freedom. She said these ideas came from ancient Greece and modern Europe. She explained that Africans learned civilization from Europeans who colonized us. She insisted that we should be grateful for European education that lifted us from darkness. I believed these lies completely as a child. I thought Europe invented everything good. I believed Africa had no history worth studying. I accepted that we needed European guidance to become civilized. I was mentally colonized through education that erased African achievement and glorified European superiority. This mental colonization continued through university. My professors taught European philosophy, European economics, European political theory. We studied Plato, Adam Smith, John Locke, Karl Marx. We learned European solutions to European problems. We never studied African thinkers who had solved African problems. The curriculum was deliberately designed to make us worship Europe and ignore Africa. Every subject taught us that knowledge came from the West. Every lesson reinforced that Africans were receivers of wisdom, not creators of it. Every class made us feel inferior to Europeans and ashamed of being African. I graduated university believing I was educated. Actually, I was colonized. I had learned to think like a European. I had absorbed their assumptions about African inferiority. I had accepted their right to define what counted as knowledge and civilization. I was mentally enslaved despite physical independence. The awakening came when I joined the military and started reading books that weren't assigned in school. I discovered African revolutionary leaders who had fought colonialism and built independent nations. I learned about Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, and many others. I found that African heroes had already developed strategies for liberation that worked. These heroes had faced the exact same problems we faced in Burkina Faso. They fought against colonial control. They struggled with economic exploitation. They battled Western interference. They dealt with corrupt leaders who served foreign interests. They confronted all the challenges I was experiencing. More importantly, they had developed solutions that worked. They had strategies for achieving independence. They had methods for building national unity. They had approaches to economic development. They had wisdom about maintaining sovereignty. They had already figured out everything we needed to know. But Western education had hidden this knowledge from us deliberately. They didn't want Africans learning from successful African revolutionaries. They didn't want us discovering that our ancestors had defeated colonialism before. They didn't want us understanding that African solutions worked better than European advice. They needed to keep us ignorant and dependent. I started studying these liberation heroes systematically. I read everything they wrote. I analyzed everything they did. I learned from their successes and their failures. I absorbed their wisdom and applied it to Burkina Faso's situation. I became a student of African revolution instead of European colonization. The first hero I studied deeply was Patrice Lumumba of Congo. He taught me the most important lesson about independence, that political freedom means nothing without economic freedom. Lumumba became Congo's first prime minister when Belgium granted independence in 1960. He gave a famous speech on Independence Day that shocked the Belgian king. While the king talked about Belgium's generous gift of freedom, Lumumba spoke truth about colonial brutality and theft. Lumumba declared that independence was not a gift from Belgium. It was won through Congolese struggle and sacrifice. He described the violence and exploitation of colonialism. He promised that Congo would take control of its own resources and wealth. He announced that political independence would lead to economic independence. Belgium and America panicked. They had planned to give Congo political independence while maintaining economic control. They wanted Congolese politicians to govern, while Belgian and American companies continued extracting resources. Lumumba's speech showed he understood this trap and would fight against it. Within months, Belgium and America organized Lumumba's overthrow and murder. They supported Congolese traitors who killed him and installed a dictator who served Western interests. They proved that they would murder any African leader who sought real independence, not just symbolic freedom. I learned crucial lessons from Lumumba's life and death. First, political independence without economic independence is meaningless. If foreign companies control your resources, you're still colonized regardless of what flag flies over government buildings. Real independence requires controlling your own wealth. Second, Western powers will kill you if you threaten their economic interests. They don't care about democracy or human rights or international law. If you try to take back control of resources they're stealing, they will murder you. This is not theory or exaggeration. This is documented historical fact, proven by Lumumba's assassination. Third, speaking truth about colonialism terrifies colonizers. Lumumba's speech was dangerous not because of what he did, but because of what he said. He named the theft and violence clearly. He refused to pretend colonialism was beneficial. He spoke truth that exposed Western lies. This truth-telling was so threatening they killed him for it. I applied these lessons directly to Burkina Faso. I understood that our political independence meant nothing while France controlled our economy through the CFA franc and resource extraction. I knew I needed to take back economic control to achieve real sovereignty. I recognized that France would try to kill me for this, just as they had helped kill Lumumba. But I also learned from Lumumba's mistakes. He had been too trusting of people around him. He didn't move fast enough to remove colonial agents from his government. He didn't build strong enough security to protect against assassination. He was murdered partly because he wasn't paranoid enough about the threats he faced. I would not repeat his mistakes. I would purge colonial agents immediately. I would build strong security. I would assume everyone wanted to kill me and take precautions accordingly. I would learn from Lumumba's death to avoid dying the same way. The second hero I studied was Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso itself. He was my direct predecessor and the greatest leader our country ever had. He taught me how to actually implement independence after taking power. Sankara came to power through military coup in 1983. He immediately began revolutionary transformation of Burkina Faso. He renamed the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of upright people. He launched programs to achieve food self-sufficiency, build schools and hospitals, and empower women. Most importantly, Sankara challenged French control directly. He refused to pay colonial debts he declared illegitimate. He reduced government salaries, including his own, to show solidarity with poor people. He sold the government's luxury cars and made officials use simple vehicles. He lived modestly while implementing policies that helped ordinary citizens. Sankara's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity and honesty. He didn't claim that development required foreign aid or foreign expertise. He argued that Burkina Faso could develop using our own resources and our own people. He proved this by achieving remarkable results in just 4 years. Under Sankara, Burkina Faso planted 10 million trees to fight desertification. We built schools that increased literacy dramatically. We vaccinated millions of children against diseases. We achieved food self-sufficiency through supporting local farmers. We did all this without foreign aid, using only our own resources and our own work. But Sankara also made enemies through his uncompromising stance. He criticized other African leaders who served Western interests. He called for continental unity against neocolonialism. He refused to moderate his positions to please France or America. He spoke truth that threatened the entire system of African dependence on the West. France organized his assassination in 1987. They supported Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's close friend, to betray and murder him. Compaoré then ruled for 27 years as a French puppet, reversing everything Sankara built and returning Burkina Faso to French control. I learned profound lessons from Sankara's life and death. First, real development comes from using your own resources, not begging for foreign aid. Sankara proved that African countries could achieve remarkable progress through mobilizing our own people and resources. We didn't need Western money or Western experts. We needed leadership that trusted African capability. Second, living modestly as a leader builds credibility and moral authority. Sankara didn't live in palaces or drive luxury cars while asking people to sacrifice. He lived simply and shared the hardships. This made people trust him and follow him willingly. Leadership by example was more powerful than leadership by command. Third, speaking truth to power is dangerous but necessary. Sankara could have stayed quiet and lived longer. He could have moderated his criticism of France and other African leaders. He could have compromised to reduce threats, but he chose truth over safety. He chose principle over survival. He chose to die with integrity rather than live as a puppet. Fourth, trust is dangerous in revolutionary struggle. Sankara trusted Compaoré completely. They were best friends who had fought together for years. This trust made him vulnerable to betrayal. Compaoré used their friendship to get close enough to kill him. The lesson was brutal in revolution. Trust no one completely, not even your closest friends. I applied Sankara's lessons while avoiding his fatal mistakes. I implemented his approach of self-reliance and using our own resources. I lived modestly to build credibility with our people. I spoke truth about French colonialism without compromise. But I didn't trust anyone the way Sankara trusted Compaoré. I assumed everyone could betray me and took precautions accordingly. I also learned from how Sankara was erased from history after his death. France and Compaoré tried to make people forget him. They removed his images from public spaces. They banned teaching about him in schools. They wanted his ideas to die with him so Burkinabe would accept French control again. But they failed because Sankara's ideas were too powerful to erase. Young people like me discovered him despite official censorship. We learned his lessons and carried forward his struggle. We proved that killing the revolutionary doesn't kill the revolution if the ideas spread widely enough. I made sure to spread revolutionary ideas as widely as possible. I taught young people about Sankara and other liberation heroes. I published their writings and speeches. I made their wisdom accessible to everyone. I ensured that killing me wouldn't kill the movement because the ideas would survive in thousands of minds. The third hero I studied was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. He taught me about the importance of Pan-African unity and the dangers of neo-colonialism. Nkrumah led Ghana to independence from Britain in 1957. He became the first leader of a sub-Saharan African country to achieve independence through largely peaceful means. He was celebrated globally as a symbol of African liberation and capability. But Nkrumah understood that individual country independence was insufficient. He argued that African nations needed to unite politically and economically to resist Western domination. He called for a United States of Africa that would pool resources and coordinate policies. He warned that without unity, African countries would remain weak and vulnerable to neo-colonial control. Nkrumah coined the term neo-colonialism to describe how Western powers maintained control after granting political independence. He explained that they used economic dependence, military bases, and puppet leaders to continue exploitation. He argued that neo-colonialism was more dangerous than colonialism because it was harder to identify and fight. Nkrumah also emphasized the importance of industrialization. He insisted that African countries needed to process their own raw materials instead of exporting them to Europe for processing. He built factories and infrastructure to add value to Ghana's resources. He understood that remaining raw material exporters meant remaining poor and dependent. But Nkrumah's vision threatened Western interests. They didn't want African unity that would increase our bargaining power. They didn't want industrialization that would compete with their factories. They didn't want leaders who understood neo-colonialism and organized against it. Western powers supported a military coup that overthrew Nkrumah in 1966 while he was traveling abroad. The coup leaders immediately reversed his Pan-African initiatives and his industrialization programs. They returned Ghana to serving Western interests as a dependent raw material exporter. I learned essential lessons from Nkrumah. First, individual country independence is vulnerable without regional unity. Burkina Faso alone could be isolated and crushed. But if we united with Mali, Niger, Guinea, and other countries, we would be much stronger. Unity multiplied our power and our ability to resist Western pressure. Second, neo-colonialism is real and requires constant vigilance. Just because we achieved political independence didn't mean we were free. Western powers had many tools to maintain control: economic dependence, military bases, intelligence networks, puppet leaders. We needed to identify and dismantle all these mechanisms of neo-colonial control. Third, industrialization is essential for real development. As long as we only exported raw materials, we would stay poor. We needed to process our own resources and create our own products. We needed factories and technology. We needed to move up the value chain from raw material exporters to industrial producers. Fourth, traveling abroad as a revolutionary leader is dangerous. Nkrumah was overthrown while outside his country. Sankara was killed while meeting with supposed allies. Revolutionary leaders needed to stay home and maintain direct control of security. Traveling created opportunities for enemies to strike. I applied these lessons systematically. I worked to build unity with neighboring countries facing similar struggles. I identified and dismantled neo-colonial control mechanisms in Burkina Faso. I promoted industrialization and processing of our resources. I rarely traveled abroad and maintained tight control of security when I did. The fourth hero I studied was Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau. He taught me about the importance of ideology and the role of culture in liberation. Cabral led the independence struggle against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. He was both a brilliant military strategist and a profound political thinker. He wrote extensively about revolution, culture, and liberation in ways that influenced movements worldwide. Cabral emphasized that liberation required ideological clarity. Fighters needed to understand why they were fighting and what they were fighting for. They needed political education, not just military training. They needed to be convinced of the justice of their cause and the possibility of victory. He also stressed the importance of culture and resistance. Colonial powers tried to destroy African culture and replace it with European culture. This cultural destruction made Africans ashamed of themselves and admiring of Europeans. Cultural resistance, maintaining African languages, traditions, and values was essential for psychological liberation. Cabral famously said, "Hide nothing from the masses of our people, tell no lies, expose lies whenever they are told, mask no difficulties, mistakes, failures, claim no easy victories." This honesty built trust between leaders and people. It created movements based on truth rather than propaganda. Most remarkably, Cabral developed these ideas while actually winning a guerrilla war. He wasn't an armchair theorist. He was a revolutionary leader who combined brilliant analysis with successful practice. His ideas worked because they were tested in real struggle. Portugal assassinated Cabral in 1973, just months before Guinea-Bissau achieved independence. But his movement continued and won because he had built strong ideological foundation and trained many leaders. His ideas survived his death and guided the movement to victory. I learned vital lessons from Cabral. First, ideological education is as important as military training. Soldiers who understood why they fought were more committed and effective than soldiers who just followed orders. I needed to educate our forces about the reasons for our struggle and the goals we sought. Second, cultural pride is essential for psychological liberation. As long as Burkinabe felt ashamed of being African and admired European culture, we would accept European domination. We needed to restore pride in our own culture, languages, and traditions. We needed to reject the mental colonization that made us worship Europe. Third, honesty with the people builds trust and strength. Leaders who lied to make themselves look good eventually lost credibility. Leaders who admitted mistakes and difficulties earned trust. I needed to be honest about challenges we faced and failures we experienced. Truth was more powerful than propaganda. Fourth, building strong institutions and training many leaders protects movements from decapitation. Cabral was killed, but his movement won because he had built structures that didn't depend on him alone. I needed to build similar institutions that would continue our struggle even if I was killed. I applied these lessons through comprehensive political education programs. We trained soldiers and citizens in revolutionary ideology. We taught African history and restored cultural pride. We were honest about difficulties and mistakes. We built institutions and trained leaders who could continue if I was removed. Listen carefully, Western intelligence agencies. Remember when you believed killing African leaders would end African resistance? Remember when you assumed our movements depended on individuals? Remember when you thought assassinating revolutionaries would preserve your control? I destroyed every assumption. I learned from murdered heroes. I avoided their mistakes. I built movements that survive leaders. Your assassination strategy failed. Your neo-colonial control ended. Your historical lessons are useless. Beyond these four major heroes, I studied many other African liberation leaders. Each taught me valuable lessons that I applied to Burkina Faso's struggle. I learned from Julius Nyerere of Tanzania about African socialism and self-reliance. He developed Ujamaa philosophy that emphasized community cooperation and independence from foreign aid. His approach had limitations, but his commitment to African solutions for African problems was inspiring and instructive. I studied Sékou Touré of Guinea, who was the only African leader to vote against joining the French community in 1958. France punished Guinea viciously for this independence, but Touré maintained sovereignty despite enormous pressure. His courage in standing alone against France showed that resistance was possible even for small countries. I learned from Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria about armed struggle and the costs of liberation. Algeria won independence through 8 years of brutal war that killed over 1 million Algerians. Ben Bella's experience taught me that freedom sometimes requires enormous sacrifice and that colonizers don't surrender control peacefully. I studied Samora Machel of Mozambique about building socialism after independence. Machel implemented radical policies that challenged Portuguese colonial legacy and Western capitalism. His successes and failures provided lessons about post-independence transformation and the difficulties of building new systems. I learned from Nelson Mandela about the complexities of negotiated transitions. Mandela achieved political freedom for South Africa but accepted economic arrangements that preserved white wealth. His experience taught me that negotiations with colonizers often preserve their economic power even while granting political independence. Each of these leaders contributed to my revolutionary education. Each taught me something valuable about strategy, ideology, or implementation. Each showed me possibilities and warned me of dangers. Together, they provided comprehensive training in African liberation that no Western university could offer. But I also learned from the failures and mistakes of liberation heroes. Many had been killed through trusting the wrong people. Many had been overthrown because they didn't move fast enough against enemies. Many had compromised too much in negotiations. Many had failed to build institutions that survived them. I studied these failures as carefully as the successes. I learned what to avoid as well as what to emulate. I understood that revolution required learning from both victories and defeats. The heroes who failed taught me lessons as valuable as the heroes who succeeded. The most important meta lesson from studying all these heroes was that African solutions worked better than European advice. Every liberation leader who succeeded had rejected Western recommendations and followed African approaches. Every leader who failed had tried to implement European models that didn't fit African realities. Lumumba succeeded by demanding economic independence, not by following Belgian advice to accept neo-colonial arrangements. Sankara achieved remarkable development by rejecting foreign aid and using our own resources, not by following IMF prescriptions. Nkrumah advanced by pursuing Pan-African unity, not by accepting the fragmentation that Western powers preferred. Cabral won by developing African revolutionary ideology, not by copying European theories. The pattern was clear and consistent. African problems required African solutions developed by African leaders based on African realities. European advice served European interests, not African interests. We needed to learn from our own heroes, not from our colonizers. This realization was liberating and empowering. I stopped looking to Europe for answers. I stopped believing that Western education made me qualified to lead. I started looking to African revolutionaries for guidance. I started trusting African wisdom over European theory. The transformation in my thinking was complete. I went from mentally colonized student who worshipped Europe to revolutionary leader who learned from African heroes. I went from believing Africa had no history worth studying to understanding that our liberation heroes had already solved our problems. I went from accepting European superiority to recognizing African excellence. This mental decolonization was as important as any political or economic change. As long as I believed Europeans were superior, I would accept their domination. Once I understood that Africans had developed successful liberation strategies, I could implement those strategies confidently. Mental liberation enabled political and economic liberation. I worked systematically to spread this mental decolonization to other Burkinabe. We reformed education to teach African history and African heroes. We published books about liberation leaders that schools had banned. We created documentaries about revolutionary struggles that media had ignored. We made African liberation knowledge accessible to everyone. The impact was profound. Young Burkinabe learned that Africans had defeated colonialism before. They discovered that our ancestors had developed successful strategies. They understood that we didn't need European guidance. They became mentally liberated and ready to fight for real independence. This educational transformation was perhaps my most important contribution. Military coups and economic policies could be reversed by future leaders. But mental decolonization that taught people to learn from African heroes instead of worshiping European colonizers would be permanent. Once people understood the truth, they couldn't be recolonized mentally. Western education systems had deliberately hidden African liberation heroes from us. They taught us European history in detail while ignoring African revolutionary history. They made us study European philosophers while never mentioning African political thinkers. They ensured we graduated educated in European knowledge but ignorant of African wisdom. This educational colonization was strategic and deliberate. They needed us to believe that knowledge came from Europe. They required us to think that Africans had nothing to teach. They wanted us seeking European solutions to African problems. They designed education to maintain our mental dependence even after political independence. I exposed this educational colonization by showing what they had hidden from generations of African students who were taught to admire European achievements while remaining ignorant of their own revolutionary heritage. The exposure wasn't merely academic correction or historical revision, but a fundamental unveiling of systematic knowledge suppression that had been central to maintaining psychological colonization long after formal independence. Educational systems across Africa, designed during colonial periods and largely unchanged after independence, deliberately excluded African liberation heroes, minimized African intellectual achievements, ignored African political philosophy, and presented European thought as universal, while treating African ideas as provincial or primitive. This wasn't accidental oversight, but calculated strategy to maintain mental subordination even after political independence. I revealed that African liberation heroes had developed brilliant strategies that worked in practice, achieving genuine independence against enormous odds and creating models for development that succeeded where Western prescriptions failed. Patrice Lumumba articulated visions of economic sovereignty and Pan-African unity that threatened Western interests so profoundly they orchestrated his assassination. Thomas Sankara implemented revolutionary programs in Burkina Faso that achieved food self-sufficiency, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and debt independence in just 4 years, proving that African-designed solutions could transform African conditions rapidly and comprehensively. Kwame Nkrumah developed sophisticated analysis of neo-colonialism that predicted exactly how formal independence would be undermined through economic dependency and explained precisely how to resist these mechanisms. Amilcar Cabral created revolutionary theory grounded in African conditions that guided successful liberation struggles and provided frameworks for post-independence development. These heroes weren't merely brave fighters or inspiring speakers, but serious intellectuals who developed sophisticated strategies addressing the specific challenges of African liberation and development. Their strategies worked because they were grounded in African realities rather than imported from European contexts, because they prioritized economic sovereignty alongside political independence, because they understood that liberation required psychological transformation as much as institutional change, and because they learned from African conditions rather than applying foreign theories. The brilliance of their strategies becomes obvious once you study them seriously, rather than accepting the dismissive characterizations that Western education promotes. I demonstrated that African political thought was sophisticated and practical, not primitive or derivative as Western education implies, through its exclusion or marginalization. African political philosophy addresses fundamental questions about power, justice, community, and governance with sophistication matching any intellectual tradition. Ubuntu philosophy articulates conceptions of personhood and community that offer genuine alternatives to Western individualism. African socialism develops economic models that balance collective welfare with individual initiative in ways that avoid both capitalist exploitation and Soviet authoritarianism. Pan-Africanism creates frameworks for continental unity that address the specific challenges of overcoming colonial fragmentation. Liberation theology connects spiritual traditions to political struggle in ways that mobilize populations while maintaining ethical grounding. This political thought isn't merely abstract philosophy, but practical wisdom that guided successful movements and informed effective policies. When African leaders applied African political thought, they achieved results. When they abandoned it for Western models, they failed. The practical success demonstrates the sophistication and relevance of African political philosophy in ways that academic recognition never could. The thought is sophisticated because it addresses complex realities with nuanced analysis. It is practical because it emerged from actual struggles and was tested through implementation. I proved that African solutions succeeded where European advice failed, through systematic comparison of outcomes when African nations followed their own strategies versus when they accepted Western prescriptions. Countries that pursued African socialism and economic sovereignty in the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds achieved better development outcomes than those that accepted Western capitalist models and IMF structural adjustment. Nations that maintained food sovereignty through supporting small farmers outperformed those that prioritized export agriculture, as Western advisors recommended. Governments that invested in universal education and healthcare achieved better social outcomes than those that accepted World Bank recommendations for user fees and privatization. The empirical record is clear for anyone willing to examine it honestly. African solutions worked better than European advice. The failure of European advice wasn't accidental or due to poor implementation, but resulted from the advice serving European interests rather than African development. Structural adjustment programs that Western institutions imposed were designed to open African markets to Western corporations, not to promote African industrialization. Privatization that Western advisors demanded transferred African assets to foreign ownership, not to improve efficiency. Trade liberalization that Western governments required benefited Western exporters while destroying African industries. The advice failed from African perspective because success from African perspective was never its purpose. I destroyed the lie that Africa had no intellectual tradition worth studying by documenting the rich history of African philosophy, political thought, scientific knowledge, and practical wisdom that Western education systematically excludes. African intellectual traditions include sophisticated philosophical systems developed over millennia, complex political organizations that governed large populations effectively, scientific and mathematical knowledge that enabled architectural and agricultural achievements, medical knowledge that addressed tropical diseases Western medicine ignored, and practical wisdom about sustainable resource management that modern environmentalism is only now rediscovering. This intellectual heritage isn't primitive or inferior, but different, addressing different conditions and prioritizing different values than European traditions. The lie that Africa lacked intellectual traditions served crucial purpose in justifying colonialism and maintaining post-colonial subordination. If Africans had no knowledge worth preserving, then European education was pure benefit rather than cultural destruction. If African thought was primitive, then European guidance was necessary rather than exploitative. If African intellectual traditions were inferior, then adopting European models was progress rather than subordination. Destroying this lie removes justification for continued European intellectual dominance and creates space for African knowledge systems to inform African development. The exposure radicalized young people who realized they had been deliberately miseducated in ways designed to maintain their mental subordination. The realization wasn't gradual awakening but sudden shock when they discovered that heroes they had never heard of had achieved things they were told were impossible, that strategies they were never taught had worked better than approaches they were forced to learn, that knowledge they needed had been deliberately hidden while irrelevant information was emphasized. The miseducation was comprehensive, not just what they were taught but what they weren't taught, not just how African history was presented but how it was excluded, not just the content, but the entire framework that positioned European knowledge as universal and African knowledge as provincial. They became angry that schools had hidden African heroes from them, depriving them of role models, inspiration, and practical knowledge they needed. The anger was justified and healthy because the hiding was deliberate and harmful. Schools taught them about European explorers who discovered African territories that Africans had inhabited for millennia, but not about African leaders who built great civilizations. They learned about European philosophers who developed political theory, but not about African thinkers who created sophisticated governance systems. They studied European scientists who made discoveries, but not about African knowledge systems that enabled survival and prosperity in challenging environments. The systematic hiding of African heroes wasn't oversight but strategy to maintain psychological colonization. They understood that educational colonization was designed to keep them mentally enslaved, even after political independence, by ensuring they continued believing in European superiority and African inferiority, continued seeking European approval and guidance, continued accepting European domination as natural and necessary. Educational colonization was more effective than political colonization because it operated internally, making Africans complicit in their own subordination by accepting beliefs that justified it. Once they understood this design, they recognized that their entire education had been weapon used against them, that schools had been institutions of mental colonization rather than liberation, that teachers had been agents of continued subordination rather than empowerment. They recognized that learning African liberation history was itself a revolutionary act because it broke the mental chains that educational colonization had imposed. Learning about Lumumba's vision taught them to demand economic sovereignty. Studying Sankara's programs showed them that rapid transformation was possible. Understanding Nkrumah's analysis revealed how neo-colonialism operated. Examining Cabral's theory provided frameworks for resistance. Each lesson was revolutionary because it contradicted what educational colonization had taught them, because it empowered rather than subordinated them, because it provided knowledge they could use rather than information that served their colonizers. I am the architect of mental decolonization through teaching African liberation history that educational systems deliberately suppressed. The architecture wasn't accidental or improvised, but carefully designed to counter specific mechanisms of educational colonization, to provide knowledge that empowered rather than subordinated, to inspire action rather than acceptance, to build confidence rather than dependency. Mental decolonization required more than merely adding African content to European curricula. It required completely reorienting education around African liberation, prioritizing African heroes over European colonizers, emphasizing African solutions over European advice, and grounding learning in African conditions rather than European contexts. I studied heroes that schools hid, investing years in learning about leaders whose names never appeared in official curricula, whose achievements were deliberately excluded from textbooks, whose strategies were systematically suppressed by educational systems designed to maintain European intellectual dominance. The study required going beyond official sources to movement documents, to oral histories, to suppressed publications, to knowledge preserved in communities rather than institutions. The heroes I studied weren't obscure figures whose exclusion was understandable, but major leaders whose deliberate omission revealed the political purposes of educational colonization. I learned lessons that universities ignored because those lessons threatened the intellectual frameworks that justified continued European dominance. Universities taught development economics that assumed African poverty resulted from African deficiencies rather than from colonial extraction and neo-colonial exploitation. They taught political science that presented Western democracy as universal model rather than examining African governance systems. They taught history that centered European actions while marginalizing African agency. They taught philosophy that treated European thought as universal while ignoring African intellectual traditions. The lessons they ignored were precisely those that would enable African liberation from continued European domination. I applied wisdom that Western education suppressed because that wisdom provided practical strategies for achieving genuine independence. Western education suppressed knowledge about how to build economic sovereignty because economic dependency served Western interests. It suppressed understanding of how neo-colonialism operates because that understanding would enable resistance. It suppressed awareness of successful African development models because those models contradicted Western prescriptions. It suppressed recognition of African intellectual achievements because that recognition would undermine claims of European superiority. The suppressed wisdom was precisely what Africans needed for liberation. I taught young people about their revolutionary ancestors, connecting them to heritage of resistance and achievement that educational colonization had hidden. Teaching wasn't merely transmitting information, but reconnecting young Africans to their revolutionary tradition, showing them that their ancestors had fought and won against colonialism, that previous generations had developed successful strategies they could learn from, that they belonged to proud history of resistance rather than shameful history of victimization. The teaching was revolutionary because it transformed how young people understood themselves, their history, and their possibilities. I exposed the deliberate miseducation that maintained mental colonization by showing exactly what was hidden, why it was hidden, and how the hiding served continued European domination. The exposure wasn't abstract critique, but concrete demonstration of specific exclusions, particular distortions, and systematic patterns that revealed deliberate design rather than accidental oversight. Young people could see for themselves that the hiding was intentional, that the miseducation served clear purposes, that their education had been weapon used against them. The exposure was liberating because it explained their confusion, validated their suspicions, and provided framework for understanding their miseducation. Your legacy is centuries of hiding African achievement and glorifying European superiority through educational systems designed to maintain psychological colonization. The legacy is written in generations of Africans who learned more about European history than their own, who could name European philosophers but not African thinkers, who studied European political systems while remaining ignorant of African governance, who internalized beliefs in European superiority and African inferiority. The legacy is written in curricula that excluded African heroes, textbooks that marginalized African achievements, examinations that tested European knowledge while ignoring African wisdom, and educational systems that produced mentally colonized graduates even decades after political independence. My legacy is revealing African liberation heroes and teaching their revolutionary lessons to generations who were deliberately kept ignorant of their own heritage. The legacy is written in young people who now know Lumumba's vision, understand Sankara's programs, study Nkrumah's analysis, and apply Cabral's theory. It is written in educational initiatives that center African liberation history, in study groups that examine African political thought, in movements that apply African solutions, and in growing confidence that comes from understanding revolutionary heritage. The legacy is written in mental decolonization that enables genuine liberation. History will remember which approach served African liberation, and the answer is written in outcomes that demonstrate the effectiveness of African strategies versus the failure of European advice. The answer is written in the successful strategies that Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah, and Cabral developed, and that Western education deliberately hid from us, strategies that achieved genuine independence, rapid development, and popular empowerment when implemented but were suppressed because they threatened continued European dominance. You concealed knowledge to maintain control, hiding information that would enable African liberation, suppressing wisdom that would end African dependency, excluding heroes who would inspire African resistance. I revealed knowledge to enable liberation, teaching lessons that empower rather than subordinate, sharing wisdom that liberates rather than controls, celebrating heroes who inspire rather than intimidate. The lesson is eternal because it demonstrates fundamental truth about knowledge and power, that those who control what people learn control what people believe possible, that educational systems serve political purposes, that mental colonization is prerequisite for continued physical colonization, and that liberation requires mental decolonization as much as political independence. Nkrumah and Cabral developed, and that Western education deliberately hid from us, strategies that achieved genuine independence, rapid development, and popular empowerment when implemented but were suppressed because they threatened continued European dominance. You concealed knowledge to maintain control, hiding information that would enable African liberation, suppressing wisdom that would end African dependency, excluding heroes who would inspire African resistance. I revealed knowledge to enable liberation, teaching lessons that empower rather than subordinate, sharing wisdom that liberates rather than controls, celebrating heroes who inspire rather than intimidate. The lesson is eternal because it demonstrates fundamental truth about knowledge and power, that those who control what people learn control what people believe possible, that educational systems serve political purposes, that mental colonization is prerequisite for continued physical colonization, and that liberation requires mental decolonization as much as political independence. The proof is undeniable in the systematic patterns of exclusion and distortion, in the clear purposes served by educational colonization, in the transformation that occurs when people learn their true history. The outcome is permanent because mental decolonization is irreversible. Once people understand they were deliberately miseducated, once they learn the knowledge that was hidden, once they connect with their revolutionary heritage, they cannot return to previous mental subordination. The revolutionary lessons I learned from Africa's liberation heroes provided complete strategy for achieving real independence rather than the nominal independence that left economic and mental colonization intact. They taught me to demand economic freedom, not just political freedom, recognizing that political independence without economic sovereignty was meaningless, that controlling your government while foreigners controlled your economy was illusion rather than reality, that genuine independence required control over resources, production, trade, and finance. This lesson was crucial because it explained why political independence had failed to deliver genuine liberation, why African nations remained subordinate despite having their own flags and governments, why neocolonialism succeeded colonialism without fundamental change in African conditions. They showed me how to use our own resources instead of begging for foreign aid that came with conditions designed to maintain dependency. The lesson wasn't merely about rejecting aid, but about mobilizing African resources for African development, about recognizing that Africa possessed wealth sufficient for our own development if we controlled it, about understanding that foreign aid was a mechanism of control rather than assistance, about building self-reliance through utilizing what we already had rather than depending on what others might give. This wisdom was practical and empowering because it shifted focus from what we lacked to what we possessed, from external assistance to internal capacity, from dependency to self-reliance. They demonstrated the importance of Pan-African unity for overcoming the fragmentation that colonialism imposed and that neo-colonialism exploited. The lesson taught that African nations individually were vulnerable to external pressure, but collectively possessed strength to resist. That continental unity was necessary for genuine independence, that artificial borders served to divide and weaken us, that cooperation and coordination among African nations was prerequisite for development and sovereignty. This understanding was strategic because it identified unity as both goal and method, as end we sought and means to achieve it. They emphasized ideological education and cultural pride as foundations for sustained resistance to mental colonization. The lesson recognized that political and economic liberation required psychological transformation, that people needed to understand why they were fighting and what they were building, that cultural confidence was necessary to resist continued European intellectual dominance, that education wasn't merely transmitting information, but building consciousness and commitment. This emphasis was profound because it identified mental decolonization as prerequisite for other forms of liberation, as foundation upon which political and economic independence must be built. They warned me about neocolonialism and the dangers of trust in former colonizers who would seek to maintain control through new mechanisms after formal independence became inevitable. The warnings were specific and prescient. They predicted exactly how neocolonialism would operate through economic dependency, through planted leaders, through conditional aid, through monetary control, through cultural domination. They cautioned against trusting those who had colonized us, against believing promises of partnership from those who had exploited us, against accepting guidance from those whose interests opposed ours. These warnings prepared me to recognize neocolonialism when I encountered it, and to resist mechanisms I might otherwise have accepted. They prepared me completely for the struggle I would lead by providing theoretical framework, practical strategies, historical examples, and psychological preparation. The preparation was comprehensive because these heroes had faced challenges identical to those I would face, had developed solutions I could adapt, had made mistakes I could avoid, and had achieved victories I could emulate. Learning from them was more valuable than any Western education because their knowledge was relevant, their experience was applicable, and their wisdom was proven through actual liberation struggles rather than academic theorizing. These lessons worked because they came from leaders who faced identical challenges and developed successful solutions through actual struggle rather than abstract theorizing. The lessons worked because they were grounded in African realities rather than imported from European contexts, because they addressed specific conditions rather than applying universal theories, because they were tested through implementation rather than remaining theoretical, because they came from people who succeeded rather than from those who merely studied success. The practical effectiveness of these lessons demonstrated their superiority to Western education that provided irrelevant knowledge, inapplicable theories, and advice that served European rather than African interests. They weren't abstract theories from European academics who studied Africa from distance, who developed models based on European experience, who prescribed solutions serving European interests, who theorized about conditions they never experienced. European academics could be brilliant within their contexts, but their knowledge was largely irrelevant to African liberation because it emerged from different conditions, served different interests, and addressed different challenges. Their theories might be sophisticated, but they didn't work for African liberation because they weren't designed for that purpose. They were practical strategies from African revolutionaries who actually defeated colonialism through years of struggle, who learned through experience what worked and what failed, who developed approaches specifically for African conditions, who succeeded in achieving what they sought. These strategies were practical because they were proven through implementation, because they addressed real challenges rather than theoretical problems, because they came from people who actually did what they taught rather than merely studying it. The practicality made them immediately applicable and reliably effective. They were tested wisdom that proved effective in real struggle rather than untested theories that sounded plausible in academic settings. The testing was rigorous. Liberation movements that applied these lessons succeeded, while those that ignored them failed. Nations that followed these strategies achieved development, while those that accepted Western advice stagnated. Leaders who learned from African heroes accomplished transformation, while those who sought European approval maintained neo-colonial subordination. The proof was empirical and undeniable for anyone willing to examine actual outcomes rather than accepting theoretical claims. Western education hid this wisdom deliberately because it threatened their continued control over African minds, economies, and politics. The hiding wasn't accidental oversight or innocent exclusion, but calculated suppression of knowledge that would enable African liberation from continued European domination. If Africans learned that their liberation heroes had developed successful strategies, they would stop seeking European guidance. If they understood that African solutions worked better than European advice, they would reject European prescriptions. If they studied African political thought seriously, they would recognize its sophistication and relevance. If they connected with their revolutionary heritage, they would gain confidence to resist continued subordination. Western education hid this wisdom specifically to prevent these outcomes. They needed Africans to believe that European advice was necessary for development, that African solutions were primitive or impractical, that European knowledge was superior and universal, that African intellectual traditions were inferior and provincial. These beliefs were essential for maintaining neo-colonial control because they made Africans complicit in their own subordination, made them seek continued European guidance even after political independence, made them accept European domination as natural and beneficial rather than exploitative and harmful. Educational colonization that promoted these beliefs was more effective than political colonization because it operated internally and persisted after formal independence. They required us to think that African solutions were primitive or impractical, despite empirical evidence that they worked better than European prescriptions. The requirement was enforced through educational systems that excluded African solutions from curricula, through media that ridiculed African approaches, through international institutions that demanded European models, through aid that conditioned assistance on accepting Western advice. The consistent message was that African solutions were backward, that modernization required westernization, that development meant abandoning African approaches for European models. This thinking was necessary for maintaining European dominance because it made Africans reject their own wisdom in favor of advice that served European interests. They wanted us dependent on their guidance even after independence so they could continue controlling African development, so they could maintain access to African resources, so they could preserve markets for European goods, so they could prevent genuine African sovereignty that would threaten European interests. The dependency was maintained through multiple mechanisms, but educational colonization was fundamental because it made Africans believe they needed European guidance, made them doubt their own capabilities, made them seek European approval and validation. This psychological dependency was more effective than economic or political dependency because it was internalized and self-perpetuating. By learning from African liberation heroes instead of European colonizers, I escaped this mental trap that had confined generations of educated Africans who learned to think like Europeans, who internalized European values, who accepted European superiority, who sought European approval. The escape was liberation because it freed me from psychological colonization, because it connected me to my revolutionary heritage, because it provided knowledge I could use for African liberation rather than information that served European interests. The escape was possible because I deliberately chose to learn from those who succeeded in African liberation rather than from those who benefited from African subordination. I discovered that we already had the knowledge we needed for liberation and development, that our ancestors had already figured out solutions to challenges we faced, that African wisdom was sufficient for African needs, that we didn't require European guidance or approval. The discovery was revolutionary because it contradicted everything educational colonization had taught, because it revealed that dependency was imposed rather than necessary, because it demonstrated that liberation required recovering suppressed knowledge rather than acquiring new information from Europeans. The discovery was empowering because it shifted focus from what we lacked to what we possessed, from external guidance to internal wisdom, from dependency to self-sufficiency. Our ancestors had already figured out how to defeat colonialism and build independent nations through decades of struggle that developed sophisticated strategies, through experimentation that identified what worked, through sacrifice that achieved liberation, through vision that imagined alternatives to colonial subordination. They had solved problems we faced, had overcome obstacles we encountered, had achieved goals we sought. Their knowledge was directly applicable because our challenges were continuation of struggles they had fought, because neocolonialism was evolution of colonialism they had defeated, because liberation remained incomplete task they had begun. We just needed to learn from them instead of from the people who colonized us, needed to study African heroes instead of European conquerors, needed to apply African solutions instead of European prescriptions, needed to trust African wisdom instead of seeking European approval. The simplicity was profound. We didn't need to invent new knowledge, but to recover suppressed wisdom, didn't need to develop new strategies, but to apply proven approaches, didn't need external guidance, but to learn from our own heritage. The shift from learning from colonizers to learning from liberators was fundamental transformation that enabled genuine mental decolonization. This knowledge is spreading across Africa now through educational initiatives, through study groups, through social media, through cultural movements, through political organizing. Young people everywhere are discovering liberation heroes their schools hid, learning about Lumumba and Sankara and Nkrumah and Cabral, and countless others whose names never appeared in official curricula. They're learning revolutionary lessons that universities suppressed, studying strategies that worked, understanding analysis that explained neocolonialism, applying wisdom that enabled resistance. They're applying African solutions that Western advisors claimed wouldn't work, implementing programs based on African models, pursuing development strategies grounded in African conditions. They're achieving independence that colonizers insisted was impossible, building sovereignty that neo-colonialists claimed was unrealistic, creating alternatives that Western institutions said couldn't succeed. The mental decolonization is irreversible because it's based on knowledge that cannot be unknown, on connections that cannot be broken, on confidence that cannot be destroyed. Once Africans understand that our liberation heroes developed successful strategies, we stop seeking European approval and guidance because we recognize we have our own wisdom, our own heroes, our own successful models. Once we recognize that African solutions work better than European advice, we stop accepting their domination because we understand it serves their interests rather than ours, because we know we can succeed independently. Once we learn from our revolutionary ancestors, we become revolutionaries ourselves because their wisdom inspires us, their example empowers us, their success proves liberation is possible. Your educational colonization is exposed and defeated through systematic revelation of what was hidden, why it was hidden, and how it served continued European domination. The exposure is complete and undeniable. Young people across Africa now understand they were deliberately miseducated, recognize the political purposes of educational colonization, see clearly how their education was designed to maintain their subordination. Your historical lies are revealed and rejected as young Africans learn their true history, discover their revolutionary heritage, understand their ancestors' achievements. Your strategy of hiding African heroes has failed completely because those heroes are now being celebrated, studied, and emulated across the continent. We learned the lessons you tried to hide about economic sovereignty, Pan-African unity, ideological education, and resistance to neo-colonialism by deliberately seeking out the knowledge that educational systems excluded, by studying the heroes whose names were erased from official curricula, by examining the strategies that proved successful but were systematically suppressed. The lessons about economic sovereignty taught us that political independence without economic control was meaningless, that genuine liberation required ownership of our resources and control of our productive capacity, that foreign investment and aid were mechanisms of continued domination rather than pathways to development. We learned that Pan-African unity wasn't romantic idealism but strategic necessity, that continental cooperation was essential for resisting external pressure, that artificial colonial borders served to divide and weaken us, and that our strength lay in collective action rather than isolated national efforts. The lessons about ideological education revealed that liberation required transforming consciousness as much as changing institutions, that people needed to understand the systems oppressing them to effectively resist, that cultural pride and historical knowledge were weapons against psychological colonization, and that education should serve liberation rather than subordination. We learned about resistance to neo-colonialism by studying how it operated through economic dependency, planted leaders, conditional aid, and cultural domination, and by understanding the specific mechanisms that maintained exploitation after formal independence. These lessons were revolutionary because they explained our continued subordination despite political independence and provided frameworks for achieving genuine liberation. We applied the wisdom you tried to suppress about using our own resources, building our own systems, trusting our own capabilities, and rejecting your guidance by implementing programs based on African models rather than Western prescriptions. We mobilized our own resources instead of depending on foreign aid that came with conditions designed to maintain our dependency. We built our own educational systems that taught African history and celebrated African achievement rather than perpetuating European intellectual dominance. We constructed our own economic institutions that served African development rather than facilitating resource extraction. We developed our own political frameworks that reflected African values and conditions rather than importing European models that served European interests. We trusted our own capabilities by recognizing that Africans possess the knowledge, skills, and vision necessary for our own development, that we didn't need external validation or approval, and that our ancestors had already demonstrated our capacity for building great civilizations and achieving liberation. We achieved the liberation you tried to prevent by connecting with our revolutionary heritage, by learning from our liberation heroes, by applying African solutions, and by building genuine independence that encompassed economic control, political sovereignty, and mental decolonization. The connection with our revolutionary heritage provided inspiration, guidance, and confidence that enabled sustained resistance. Learning from our liberation heroes gave us proven strategies, relevant analysis, and practical wisdom that worked in African contexts. Applying African solutions demonstrated that our approaches succeeded where Western prescriptions failed, that indigenous knowledge was more effective than imported theories, and that we could solve our own problems without external guidance. Building genuine independence meant controlling our resources, governing our societies, educating our children, and determining our futures without foreign interference or approval. The victory is total because mental decolonization is complete, because educational colonization is exposed, and because African knowledge is recovered and being applied across the continent. Mental decolonization means Africans no longer internalize beliefs in European superiority or African inferiority, no longer seek Western approval as validation, and no longer accept subordination as natural or necessary. Educational colonization being exposed means young people understand they were deliberately miseducated, recognize the political purposes of knowledge suppression, and reject the frameworks that justified their psychological subordination. African knowledge being recovered means we have access to the wisdom of our ancestors, the strategies of our liberation heroes, and the intellectual traditions that our colonizers tried to destroy. The transformation is permanent because it's irreversible, because knowledge cannot be suppressed again once it's been widely disseminated, and because confidence cannot be destroyed once it's been built on solid foundations of achievement and understanding. The irreversibility comes from fundamental changes in consciousness that cannot be undone, from institutional transformations that have created new realities, and from generational shifts where young people grow up with mental decolonization as their starting point rather than as a goal to achieve. Knowledge cannot be suppressed again because it's now preserved in multiple forms, taught in numerous institutions, shared through various media, and embedded in popular consciousness. Confidence cannot be destroyed because it's based on actual achievements, proven capabilities, and recovered heritage rather than on empty assertions or external validation. The future belongs to Africans who learn from African heroes, not to colonizers who hide African achievement, because we control our own education now, because we teach our own history, because we celebrate our own heroes, and because we apply our own wisdom to building the futures we envision. We control our own education through institutions we've created, curricula we've designed, and pedagogies we've developed that serve liberation rather than subordination. We teach our own history by centering African agency, celebrating African achievement, and honestly examining both our victories and our challenges. We celebrate our own heroes by studying their strategies, honoring their sacrifices, and continuing their struggles for complete liberation. We apply our own wisdom by trusting African solutions, building on African knowledge, and creating systems that reflect African values and serve African interests.